development is by no means a hard science. The tech is constantly changing, and making a perfect game is, for all intents and purposes, unachievable. Outside of Banjo-Kazooie, of course. Even then, though, the best ideas just sometimes don't work when it comes time to ship a product. The Kirby franchise is renowned for its consistently good games over the years, but in this case, consistent quality is often tied to consistent game design. Though, while the core concept remains the same for each mainline Kirby game, the series itself isn't static. Much like the series mascot himself, the games are highly adaptive, constantly tweaking and trying new ideas as they contend with new trends and technology. It only makes sense that some things get left behind as the series marches into the future. The games have a tendency to add new mechanics, drop said new mechanics, then re-add said new mechanics again in the future. There's countless reasons why they do this, of course. Sometimes the ideas are just hard to implement, sometimes they're just not very good, and sometimes it's just time to retire them, move on to something new. You see, Kirby is always trying something new, constantly throwing darts at a board to see what sticks. After all, it's not easy to make almost 20-something games with what's effectively the same formula at the end of the day. Each Kirby game generally introduces a few new ideas that get swapped out in the next Kirby game. Though out of the entire series, there's one game that got dropped the hardest. Kirby and the Crystal Shards had so many ideas get the axe, it's safe to say the game was effectively abandoned. Now let me clarify something before we get into the weeds here. When I say Kirby 64 was abandoned, I don't mean it's been forgotten. Nintendo has always given the game plenty of homages in the form of Smash Bros. References and references in future Kirby games. What I mean by abandon is the fact that the game introduced a ton of new and exciting concepts that were ultimately never seen again in the Kirby franchise. Well, at least not in the way they were originally presented. While we're likely to never get an official reason as to why they were abandoned, the writing is on the wall. We can easily theorize why some of these things got dumped in the first place. Now, for a bit of context here, Kirby and the Crystal Shards was in many ways an odd game in the series from the outset. This was the first Kirby game to take place in the third dimension, and it was cobbled together in roughly 3 years. The only 3D Kirby game to come out on the N64, it would be 11 more years till a traditional Kirby game would reappear on a home console again. For a multitude of reasons, the developers struggled to come up with a follow-up to this game. In fact, they would go on to cancel 3 mostly functional games until Kirby would finally return to Dreamland in Kirby's Return to Dreamland. Kirby 64 came out just a few years after the Super Nintendo games Kirby Superstar and Kirby's Dream Land 3. Superstar in particular was considered a revolutionary leap forward for the Kirby series, and would later go on to receive a remake. Gameplay-wise, these games would prove difficult contenders to match, as the leap to 3D meant game development was significantly more resource-intensive. Now, Kirby and the Crystal Shards wasn't exactly a huge leap forwards gameplay-wise. It was 2.5D, meaning it played just like the older titles, but with chunkier controls and very expensive graphics. The game would release to average to positive-ish reviews. However, despite the relative success of the game, it wouldn't have the lasting legacy one would think. Most of the new ideas implemented here were dumped in later games, and the visual style was quickly abandoned for some reason. Now, the question of the hour is why most of the game was left to rot. Despite the lack of an official answer, some of the issues with these new mechanics are kind of easy to dissect. First, let's address the 300-pound penguin in the room. The combo copy abilities, the signature gimmick of this game. For those unfamiliar, the whole shtick with Kirby games is boring enemies to steal their power, known as a copy ability. In a first for the series, Kirby 64 let the player combine abilities. Mixing and matching any pair of 7 core abilities led to a whopping 35 powers to be had. While a big number is always very exciting, this high amount of powers had a bit of a cost to it. While this isn't a huge amount of abilities for the series, remember that 3D game development is significantly harder than 2D, and the developers likely bit off a bit more than they could chew. Why do I think they underestimated the project? Well, Kirby 64 received a significant amount of cuts throughout development. the largest of which being support for 4 playable characters. Unfortunately for you guys, the only evidence I actually have for this claim are extremely blurry photos yoinked from the cutting room floor. See that? See that right there? If that's not enough proof, you can see the aftermath of this decision throughout the entire game, with Waddle, Adeline, and King Dedede showcased in every cutscene and promotional material for this game, despite playing an extremely minor role in the final product. Only King Dedede would remain playable, and only in certain locations. So, multiple characters had to get dumped for the sake of getting this thing out. That makes you think that there may have been more things that suffered under the developer's ambition. And you know what they say.
Where there's smoke, there's fire.
For starters, while there are in fact 35 abilities to play with, most of them are varying degrees of useless. In previous games, abilities were fairly well balanced, each having strengths and weaknesses and catering to certain playstyles. Here, however, the power balance is completely out of whack. The developers were now limited by the fact that all abilities now had to make sense based on their elemental combination. Not a small or easy feat. All enemies outside of bosses die in one hit, meaning the only thing that really matters is how quick you can get an attack off and from how safe a range. And let me tell you, most of these abilities really struggle with this, and in some cases are an active hindrance that'll get you killed. Note that each ability here can do one thing, and if that one thing isn't what you need, you're going to find yourself not using it. In fact, an ability can really get you killed if used in the wrong circumstances. Need an example? Cutter is normally the bread and butter of any Kirby game, offering quick damage at a safe range. Here, however, Kirby launches his entire face, blessing you with 4 seconds of being completely vulnerable to attack. In fact, many of the abilities have long windups, or disable jumping and hovering, making death by falling a very likely event. Another oddity with the system is that in many cases, comboing will actually make your ability worse. For instance, a single fire is a quick flaming dash that's useful for dispatching enemies in front of you. Fire times fire, however, is completely useless, as it disables your controls for almost 5 seconds, and goes so damn far it can launch you directly into a hazard you couldn't even see when you triggered it. Electric 2 has more range than Electric 1, but is effectively unable to hurt bosses. The end result of this? You're going to find a good combo ability, and you are never going to leave it unless you absolutely have to. With 35 combo abilities out there, it's hard to keep track of which ones are good or not, meaning a new combo is a risky proposition. This is made even worse by the fact that a good chunk of the crystal collectibles you need to collect are locked behind special blockages. These color-coded barricades will only break if you have the right ability combination. The problem with this is you don't know in advance what you're going to need, and there's only a 1 in 35 chance you'll have it half the time. If you're lucky, the enemies you need to inhale will be nearby, but more often than not, you'll be finding yourself replaying the entire level with the combo you need. So the combo ability was rough around the edges. It was likely that it was dumped due to the fact it's very difficult to make 35 combinations that were all balanced and interesting, while at the same time making sense with the elements used to create them. Could it have been fixed in future installments? Probably. But for now, the series is running with an elemental combo system where certain abilities can be charged up with the basic element of your choice. This completely different approach to comboing was first introduced in Squeak Squad and is likely to see a bit more evolution as the series progresses. So, while combo abilities weren't the only Kirby 64 concept that fizzled, they were definitely the biggest one. Now let's take a look at the runner-up for the biggest dumped concept, the level design. What's funny about this is it had the exact opposite problem of the combo abilities. While the levels held up remarkably well, they just weren't sustainable in the long run. Mainline Kirby games, old and new, use tileable blocks of geometry to piece together their levels. While there are many different themes and props for these pieces, the general structure remains the same. This allows level designers to quickly piece together sprawling worlds, with the ability to quickly test gameplay and flow. Of course, a side effect of this meant certain levels would appear a bit samey, but it's ultimately the most efficient way to go about it. Kirby and the Crystal Shards, however, relied heavily on custom level pieces. Each level had its own distinct textures, backgrounds, geometry, and props. This meant every level was extremely distinct and had a visual style that still holds up to this day thanks to the quality texture work. There was just so much variety here that each level would often feature multiple aesthetics as you progressed. Now, by today's standards, this isn't really all that new and exciting, but at the time this was quite a feat. Again though, these pretty worlds came at a cost, as all good things in this world do. The game was short, extremely short, as were most 2D platformers at the time. Each world had only 3 or 4 levels in addition to a boss. While being short and sweet isn't inherently bad, it got railed on pretty hard at the time for the sparse content. After this, the games went back to traditional level tiling and asset reuse, and that continues to be the trend to this day. Sure, it perhaps isn't as exciting to look at, but future Kirby games would have longer levels and more levels to explore in general. Now it's time to talk about the things that were dumped for more mysterious reasons. The enemies in Kirby 64 were largely either new to the series, or yanked straight out of Kirby's Dream Land 3. Out of the entire roster of new enemy designs, literally only one would reappear in a mainline game. This special lad Plug was the only one who was spared from the Great Purge, getting a makeover for Kirby Star Allies. And to be honest, I'm not too sure why. The Kirby series in general tends to refresh its aesthetic periodically, and this would be the last time we see most of the enemies that originated from the Kirby's Dream Land series too. Perhaps the new Kirby 64 designs were just too simple for the newer games, or maybe it was just their time to go. If I were to guess why Plug achieved salvation, it would probably be due to the lack of good electrical enemies in the series. Either way, I'm glad this very special appliance has blessed us in Kirby Star Allies. Oh, and I almost forgot. Adeline. This magically gifted painter was sorta kinda introduced in Kirby's Dream Land 3, and was splattered all over Kirby 64. Yet unlike Waddle Dee and dedede, she would never be seen again. Outside of Kirby Star Allies DLC, that is. In this case, I think it was more a matter of the series moving on. After all, her signature ability to paint would be retired until many games later. That pretty much covers it up for the questionable cuts. The rest of the stuff is pretty bog standard, to be honest. The game sported a minigame collection and a variety of unique bosses that never came back, but it happens pretty often within this series. Outside of music, direct references to Kirby 64 are sparse within the series as a whole. Oddly enough though, the mediocre vehicle segments will be completely revamped in Kirby's epic yarn. But it's kinda hard to call that a mainline Kirby game. So overall, Kirby 64 was very much a product of its time, trying to evolve the franchise while grappling with some very complex tech. While the game was competently made, most of the big concepts it toyed with ended up being one-ups, never reappearing in the series. Combo abilities proved too difficult to work from a gameplay perspective, while the level design strategies weren't modular enough to make whole games out of. The complete lack of a follow-up showed that the developers might not have been ready to make the first leap into 3D platforming, with several failed attempts demonstrating how dang hard it was to innovate. While Kirby 64's unique quirks were largely abandoned by the series, that doesn't mean they were mistakes. Much like a person, a game series needs to grow and adapt to be successful. Kirby had to make the leap into 3D eventually, and it was only through experimentation that they finally managed to nail it. So let's not forget about this experiment, and how Kirby 64 took the first steps towards the modern Kirby we know today. And with that, that's all I have for you guys this time. If you liked what you see, make sure to subscribe to stay up to date. Until next time, see ya!